star in the sky, a star revealed with the coming of day. One shines less, the other twice as much, but for each there is a star up high. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. My name is Mataniyahu Engelman and I am the Technion's Executive Vice President and Director General. The words I have read earlier are from a famous Israeli song named "To Every Man a Star," written by Gilad Ben Shach. I chose this personal song because of the personal and immediate connection it makes between us, immortal humans, and the stars, those above us and those that are in our souls. On behalf of Technion, I would like to welcome all of you to tonight's lecture, John Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and the American Space Program. The lecture is part of the International Space University's 29th Space Studies program, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome once again the faculty and the participants of SSP 2016 to Israel and to the Technion. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our many sponsors whose help and support are vital to the success of this amazing program, as well as to the staff and the organizers of the program from ISU, Technions, and the Usher Space Center. We at the Technion are pleased to hold SSP 2016 as part of our extensive international scientific outreach. Welcome students and researchers from all over the world at our Haifa campus is a great importance to us, and I am proud to inform you that right now, as part of our international school, there are over 1,000 international students on campus. Moreover, this past year, we reached a record number of over 250 postdoctoral students. 2/3 out of them are international. Technion's president, Professor Lavi, has set the explanation of our international activity as a target for the coming years in order to maintain scientific excellence at the Technion. We expect that many more international groups will arrive on campus in the coming years alongside the opening of Technion branches in the United States and China. When thinking about the topic of tonight's lectures, I could not help but recall how in the books of Genesis it says, God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night and the stars. Commentators often talk about the educational message in this verse. In the first part of the verse, it states that God created two great lights. And in the second part, the sun is named the great light and the moon the little light. This begs the question, why did the moon become a lesser light? According to the Jewish tradition, the Midrash, and the Talmudic legend, the reason for that is because the moon complained and said, it is impossible to have two kings governing the sky. God, said the moon, should decide on only one king. In response, God decided to reduce the complaining moon and to leave him a little bit smaller and the sun larger. But in order that the moon not to regret too much, assigned the stars to accompany him every night. I believe we can learn from this story about the importance of the partnership and friendship required of all those created, and especially among humans living under the sky. We must respect every person, and only through true partnership will we be able to achieve anything. The story resonated with me not only because it deals with the moon, although from a somewhat different perspective, but because it deals with people. And people, the decision they took and the actions that followed are at the core of tonight's lecture. The 1961 decision by US President John Kennedy to send astronauts to the moon before this decade is out remains the most dramatic choice in space history. And on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong took one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind to fulfill that goal. The success of the Apollo 11 mission raised the question, what do you do next after landing on the moon? It fell to President Richard M. Nixon to answer this question. The reasons for Kennedy's decision and the steps that young president took to turn the decision into a successful Apollo program, as well as deliberations by President Richard Nixon to end the Apollo programs and put the US space programs on a different course, have left many open questions unanswered. These questions and many others will be at the center of this evening's lectures by ISU faculty member Dr. John M. Logsdon. Dr. Logsdon is a professor emeritus at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, where he was the founder and the longtime director of GW's Space Policy Institute, author among many articles, essays, and edited books of After Apollo, Richard Nixon and the American Space Program, 2015, the award-winning study John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon, 2010, the decision to go to the moon, Project Apollo and the National Interest, 1970, and general editor of the multi-volume series exploring the unknown, selected documents in the history of the US civil space program. Logsdon is sought-after commentator on space issues. In 2003, he was a member of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board and formerly was a member of the NASA Advisory Council. I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Logsdon to the floor.
Thank you. Good evening. Make sure I get everything in the right order. Well, as has just been said, I've spent the last 8 years since I left full-time academic teaching and administration doing research and writing on the political history of the American space program. And it has resulted in the 2 books. The students who didn't get copies of the books, these are already spoken for. But here are the 2 books that have resulted over these past 8 years. Just for reference, we're now working on a 3rd book on President Ronald Reagan in space. So if I come back in 2 or 3 years, I'll have 3 books to talk about. These books are very detailed histories based on primary documents and interviews with the people that were participating in the decisions that shaped the American space program. They've led me to a series of conclusions, which I'll summarize now, and then hopefully what I present to you will support this summary. I believe that the decisions made by Kennedy in '61 and subsequently, and by Richard Nixon in '69 through 1972, really have shaped what the United States has done, in particular in human spaceflight, for more than a half a century. None of the presidents since, the 6 presidents that the United States has had since Richard Nixon, have had an equivalent impact. Probably the most surprising conclusion that will come out of tonight's discussion, I mean, most people think of Kennedy in space. Very few people think of Richard Nixon in space, but it's the decisions made by Richard Nixon that I think have had the lasting impact over the past 40 years. We may finally be ending the Nixon era, which gave us the space shuttle and then the space station. Although it was President Ronald Reagan that approved the space station, the decision that Nixon made to build a shuttle, to approve a shuttle capable of launching a space station, was essentially a decision eventually that there would be a space station. So we're at a transition point in the US space program. President Barack Obama in 2010 set the goal of sending people to Mars in the 2030s. We'll see whether the next president, whoever he or she may be, stays the course with that decision. If that happens, then we are really in a transition point. But let's look back at first John Kennedy and the space program and what shaped his views. And I think most of you know it didn't start with John Kennedy, it started with Yuri Gagarin. The Soviet Union, first country to launch a satellite in 1957, then became the first country to put a person into orbit on April the 12th, 1961. The public reaction around the world to that achievement was very positive and very high. The US political system said, why isn't it the United States that's doing these sort of things? And a new young president who had campaigned on getting America moving again came to the conclusion that the United States could not, by default, let the Soviet Union continue to achieve dramatic firsts in space. He told his advisors 2 days after the Gagarin flight, there's nothing more important than the United States taking a clearly leading position in space. He wrote a memo a few days later to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who he had put in charge of space policy in the early days of his administration, with a remarkably clear statement of purpose, which is in this box here. Is there a space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win? So space, dramatic, win were the three requirements that Kennedy set out. He asked for a recommendation on how to achieve those requirements, meet those requirements, and the answer came back, go to the moon. Why? There's really a technical reason and a political reason. The technical reason is that the Soviet Union had used a particular rocket called the R-7 to launch Sputnik, to launch Gagarin, but it was not powerful enough to send people to the surface of the moon. Both the United States and the Soviet Union would have to develop new rockets in order to achieve a lunar landing. But anything less dramatic than a lunar landing, the Soviet Union might be able to do with its existing rocket. So Wernher von Braun, the emigre German engineer, was consulted by the White House, and he said a more powerful rocket is required, and that we have an excellent chance of beating the Soviets to the moon. Dr. von Braun was not modest. He basically was saying, the Soviet Union does not have me. I have come to the United States to help with the US space program, and because I'm here, we will win this rocket building race. And he was right. In a technical sense, the race to the moon was really a race to build a big rocket. And we'll talk a little bit about why the United States won that race. The political rationale was stated in a very interesting memorandum from the head of NASA, James Webb, Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in rhetoric that seems a little strange more than 50 years later. This was the time of the Cold War, of a zero-sum competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for global leadership. First, a good question of whether it maintains its validity today. It is men, not merely machines, that capture the imagination of the world. That was the argument in any case, and that large-scale space projects aimed at prestige are part of the battle along the fluid front of the Cold War. it's not the kind of rhetoric that you usually associate with space policy decisions, but it was definitive and determinative. And a few weeks later,
the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
He not only said the words, classic words, before the decade is out, but was willing to commit the resources. The United States very quickly engaged in a peaceful but warlike mobilization of human and financial resources to carry out Kennedy's mandate. The NASA budget went up 89% the first year, 101% the second year, 40% the third year after Kennedy's speech. Think what any country could do with that kind of increase in budget. A massive investment, which we're still benefiting from today in 2016, in building the facilities to carry out a major space program with the construction of the facilities, particularly Launch Complex 39 at Kennedy Space Center. And NASA doubled in size, and the contractor workforce quadrupled in size. So this was a really big deal. And it's worth thinking, would anything like that ever happen again? My answer is no, just to anticipate a question at the end. The decisions were being made how to do this. When Kennedy made his speech, it wasn't clear how we were going to get to the moon. There was a debate that lasted until June of 1962, and really even a little later, of what method to get to the moon. And there was strong disagreement between NASA's leadership and the White House technical advisors. And Kennedy listened to the debate and finally said, NASA, it's your responsibility to do the job. We'll go with the approach, which was the so-called lunar orbit rendezvous. We're used to space rendezvous now, but think back then, we had, at that point, launched one person into orbit, and Kennedy was saying, in order to succeed, spacecraft have to join together in orbit around the moon, 240,000 miles away. Same inspection trip he made in September of 1962. He made a very stirring speech in Rice University Stadium in Houston. People in Houston like to say that Kennedy announced his decision to go to the moon then, but those people from Houston are wrong. But the lasting phrase that everybody remembers, or phrases,
we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Kennedy clearly was interested in getting to the moon first. The head of NASA, Mr. Webb, wanted a more balanced program that included leadership in science and other projects, and they argued about it. People know that Richard Nixon recorded conversations in the White House. Most people don't know that Kennedy also recorded conversations. Here's Kennedy and Webb arguing about the priority to be given to getting to the moon.
That it could affect the design of the Apollo.
That's Kennedy.
I would certainly not favor spending $6 to $7 billion to find out about space, no matter how on the schedule we're doing. I'd spell it out over 5 or 10 year period. If we could spend it on, why are we spending $7 million in getting fresh water from salt water when we're spending $7 billion to find out about space? So obviously you wouldn't put it on that priority except for the defense implications. And the second point is the fact that the Soviet Union has made this a test of the system. So that's why we're doing it. So I think we've got to take the view that this is the key program, and the rest of it, we can find out about it, but there's a lot of things we want to find out about.
But you see, when
Cancer and everything else.
you talk about this, it's very hard to draw a line between what
I
permitted
think
Russia.
everything that we do ought to really be tied into getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians.
Why can't it be tied to preeminence in space, which are your own words?
Because by God, we've been telling everybody we're preeminent in space. For 5 years, nobody believes it because they have the booster and the satellite. We know all about the number of satellites we put up, the 2 or 3 times the number of the Soviet Union. We're ahead scientifically. It's like that instrument you've got at Stanford, which is costing us $100.
Oh, you get the idea. There is the image looking back because Apollo was successful that Kennedy got up in 1961, said, let's go to the moon, and everybody saluted, and we just marched to the success of the Apollo 11 mission. Not true. By 2 years, criticism about misplaced priorities. Former President Dwight Eisenhower, skeptical about the value of a space race, called it nuts to be spending money going to the moon. The Republican Party, Kennedy was a Democrat, the Republicans said our real enemy in space is the Soviet spacecraft 200 miles above us. Why are we focusing on the moon? Why don't we worry about what's happening closer to Earth? The liberal community said, with all this money, we could educate many more teachers, we could build housing, we could solve hunger. Why are we spending the money on space? Kennedy took these criticisms rather seriously and asked for reviews of the Apollo program twice in 1963. He probably didn't know very much about the fact that inside of NASA, the program was behind schedule and having technical troubles and management troubles, which resulted in the first head of the program basically getting fired and a new man named George Miller brought in. And the Congress had lost its enthusiasm. After these rapid budget increases in the first several years, the Congress in August of 1963 was ready to cut the budget by 10%, which would have made it almost impossible to get to the moon by the end of the decade. So this was not a clear-cut situation. How did Kennedy respond? He was worried about the growing costs. He was worried about political criticism, and he was worried that his support of Apollo would be a factor against him when he ran for re-election in 1964. He took 2 different approaches to dealing with that criticism. I find in talking to audiences, the first of these nobody knows about unless they are really careful students, which is the idea that instead of competing, we should go to the moon together with the Soviet Union. Kennedy had wanted to cooperate from the start. In his inaugural address, he said, let us explore the stars together, addressing the Soviet Union. 10 days after the May 25th, 61 announcement of the decision to go to the moon, Kennedy met with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev for the one and only time in Vienna, and at both lunches, he said, let's do it together. It was Khrushchev that said no. Kennedy was ready to cooperate. And then, as he was dealing with these criticisms in '63, he, in a very public way, said,
Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity, in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon.
Well, 2 months after giving that speech, Kennedy was assassinated. It's kind of, and Nikita Khrushchev's son, Sergei, now a U.S. citizen, says his father was on the way of saying, yes, let's try to do it together. Fascinating to run the counter history. What would have happened if in 1963 Apollo had become a cooperative project? Would it have sustained? Would we have ever gotten to the moon? You can't tell the answer to that because it didn't happen. In fact, there was no space race in 1963 because the Soviet Union did not have a lunar landing program. It was not until 1964, August of 64, that the Soviet leadership decided to compete with the United States. So the US had basically a 3-year head start in the race to the moon, and it's not too hard to win a race with that kind of start. Plus the Soviet leadership didn't commit the money to it. So that basically, while Kennedy was alive, the United States was racing only itself. The Soviet Union did build a big rocket, the N-1, tried 4 times to launch it, and it failed 4 times. But there was a lunar landing spacecraft, a crew was trained. The race was real after '64. Was Kennedy thinking about changing in these final months of his life? At the same time, he mandated a review of all U.S. space efforts. And some of the people involved in the review said, we don't really need to race to the moon. Just by starting the race, developing our capabilities, we've minimized the Soviet advantages. Maybe we slow down, relax the end of the decade deadline. The Secretary of Defense, McNamara, again said, you can't use a military justification for Apollo. There isn't any military value in getting to the moon. Kennedy had thought about that. And of all organizations, the Bureau of the Budget said, we've got the money. There's no reason to stop unless you've changed your political mind. Whether Kennedy knew the results of the review in a preliminary fashion is not clear. He went off on another inspection trip on November the 16th, 1963. The date's important because 6 days later was when he was assassinated. There he was briefed with the model of the vehicle assembly building and the Saturn V rocket. And the NASA number 3 person, who turned out to be a classmate of Kennedy's at Harvard, Bob Seaman, said maybe it wasn't until he saw these models and looked at the facilities that he really got a sense of what he had started, the real immense dimensions of his project. And then Kennedy drove out to the launch pad where a Saturn I, not the moon rocket, but a smaller version, still big, but was being readied for launch. He was briefed there by Wernher von Braun, and as you see, the picture of Kennedy and von Braun and Siemens over von Braun's shoulder is what I used for the cover of the book. That launch would have given did give the United States the leadership in space lifting power, and that excited Kennedy. He said, hey, this is really good stuff. There's a book that was published after I finished the Kennedy book, by his Secret Service detail, saying he came back from this visit to the Space Center talking with great enthusiasm about what he had seen and how exciting it was. But 6 days later, he fell victim to an assassin's bullet, and Apollo became a memorial to a fallen young president. There was almost no chance that Apollo would be modified or changed. What would happened if Kennedy had lived? He gave the day before his assassination a speech at the dedication of an aerospace medical center. And as you listen to this, think if it sounds like somebody that was ready to quit or relax.
We have a long way to go. Many weeks and months and years of long, tedious work lies ahead. There will be setbacks and frustrations and disappointments. There will be, as there always are, pressures on this country to do less in this area as in so many others, and temptations to do something else that's perhaps easier. But this research here must go on. This space effort must go on. The conquest of space must and will go ahead. That much we know. That much we can say with confidence and conviction. Frank O'Connor, the Irish writer, tells in one of his books how, as a boy, he and his friends would make their way across the countryside. And when they came to an orchard wall that seemed too high and too doubtful to try and too difficult to permit their voyage to continue, they took off their hats and tossed them over the wall, and then they had no choice but to follow them. This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it.
I like listening to Kennedy talk. So what do you think? What does one think? What do I think about Kennedy's decision to go to the moon? Was it a good decision? How do you make judgments of what is good and bad in a momentous decision like that? Did this mic just go off?
No mic. No sound.
Yeah. I'll use this. How do you evaluate the decision? Well, Kennedy was, the space community likes to think of Kennedy as a visionary, but he was not a visionary in terms of space exploration. He never justified Apollo in terms of science. He was a politician, a pragmatic national leader who came to a decision that being first in space was in the interest of the United States. And he chose a lunar landing mission as a way of demonstrating that. So I think in terms of Kennedy's rationale of U.S. power, of U.S. pride, of U.S. leadership, Apollo was a great success. I think it was less good for the U.S. space program. It used up very quickly the moon as a destination without the ability to make it part of a sustained program. In a sense, as you'll see, the program started over after Apollo with the space shuttle and the space station. And it created, with this mobilization of effort, a very large space industry university complex that required being fed, continuing demands for large resources, and a particular way of doing business that was not very congenial to innovation. So I think in terms of the evolution of the U.S. space program, Apollo is more negative than positive. That's something we can talk about. By contrast, this picture's not fair. I showed you a very nice picture of a handsome young president at Rice University. Here's Nixon in a rainstorm at the launch of Apollo 12 in November of 1969 with his wife, NASA Administrator Tom Paine on the right, his daughter in front of him. Nixon, when he was sworn in as president, January the 20th, 1969, it was clear it was going to be up to him to make decisions on what to do after we were getting to the moon. Apollo 8 at December, Christmas time, 1968, had made it pretty clear that it was just a matter of months before the United States would land on the moon, and Kennedy's goal would be achieved. Lyndon Johnson, who had been the president after Kennedy was assassinated, had refused to make decisions on what to do after Apollo, saying it's up to the next person, who turned out to be Richard Nixon. Nixon had been involved in space matters. I should have said, by the way, Kennedy, coming into the presidency, had very little involvement in space, knew very little about it. He learned very quickly. By contrast, Nixon had been an active participant in 1957 and 58 of what to do, how to react to the Sputnik success of the Soviet Union. He had been an advocate of a separate civilian agency, which turned out to be NASA. In May of '68, so before he became president, he said in the same speech two almost totally different things. He said, we must support a space program that is second to none, and he said, the next president's got to cut the space budget. And it was that contradiction, that ambivalence, I think that summarizes the approach that Nixon took to space in his time in the White House. He hired on to be NASA administrator, a true believer in the space vision, a real dreamer, a man named Tom Paine, Dr. Thomas Paine. Nixon couldn't get people he wanted to take the NASA job because they were very uncertain, these people, what the post-Apollo environment would be like. So kind of by default, Paine was offered the job, and he was already acting administrator. He was a Democrat in a Republican administration. Fascinated by naval analogies. He was a submarine officer during World War II, and he saw NASA as a kind of an exploration institute. And made the suggestion already in March of '69 that after the moon, Mars was the right goal. So he was the one that brought the idea of going to Mars into play. There was created a inside the government high-level committee called the Space Task Group, chaired by, at that time, my governor, Spiro Agnew, who had become vice president. It was Paine's views that captured the Space Task Group. And Paine used human missions to Mars in the 1980s. I'll show you the schedule in a minute. But as justification for what NASA really wanted to do after Apollo was a large 12-person space station serviced by a vehicle to go back and forth with crew and cargo, a shuttle. That's where the space shuttle came from. And here's the recommendations given to Nixon by the Space Task Group. And if I can get this to work, look at the initial Mars expedition, leaving in '81 or '83 or '86, with all the things before that. 12-person space station, then a 50-person space based, then a 100-person one by the mid-'80s, and by the way, an Earth-to-orbit transportation system to go along with the space station. This is where the shuttle entered the program. This was presented to Nixon and his advisors. This is the meeting in the White House cabinet room in which the report was presented. The fundamental answer is no way. We, the Nixon administration, are not at all interested in continuing an Apollo-like post-Apollo program. There was a series of budget decisions, the end product of which was a significantly lower NASA budget, even given the success of Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. What happened? Well, the immediate result of this was that the United States on purpose gave up its capability to explore by ending the production of the Saturn V moon rocket. Just basically threw it away after billions of dollars of investment. And NASA, or at least Paine, was willing to accept the end of Saturn V as a way of freeing up money for a space station and a space shuttle. You can look back at that decision and say, with that decision, the United States gave up for the indefinite future, till today, the capability to send humans anywhere beyond 240 or 400 kilometers above the Earth, really a near destination. This was kind of inconsistent with what Nixon was saying. Again, you all know that Nixon recorded conversations in the Oval Office and in the Cabinet Room. Probably most people have never heard them. So here are two kind of difficult to hear, but listen, Nixon tapes.
Once a nation gives up in the competition to explore the unknown, or once it accepts a position of inferiority, it ceases to be a great nation. What happened to Spain? It happened in the 20th century to the French and later the British. And it could happen to the United States. And that's what it's all about. And so when you look at these various things, as to the space program and the rest, whether it's the moon, whether it's Mars, or whether it's a shuttle, or who knows what it is, I don't care what it is. The main thing is we gotta go. We gotta go because we gotta find out. And out of this year at all.
All right, that's March the 9th. Basically 2.5 weeks later, he comes back to the same idea in a different conversation.
The United States should not drop out of any competition in a breakthrough in knowledge and exploring the unknown. That's one of the reasons I support the space program. I don't give one damn about space. So I'm one of the space cadet types.
So what did Nixon think about space? Hard to know. He issued finally a statement in response to the Space Task Group, which I've called the Nixon Space Doctrine. And I would argue that this has been the defining policy for the U.S. civilian space program since 1970, where he says it's a continuing process, not a series of leaps like Apollo. We have to figure out the space budget in terms of a competition with all the priorities. Space has to become a normal and regular part of our national life. That competition for budgetary resources, rather than treating space as special, has been, I think, the overriding characteristic of at least the budgetary allocations to space since 1970. One of the things that there is some confusion about is who ended Project Apollo. And the answer is not only Richard Nixon, but the NASA leadership. It was the NASA leadership that said, given the money outlook, given our desire to start some new things, and given the risks of every Apollo flight, again, one in retrospect doesn't realize that this equipment was operating at a high risk level. But it was certainly dramatically shown by the Apollo 13 mission. It was NASA's leaders that proposed canceling the last two scheduled Apollo flights, which were 18 and 19, and renumbering the three remaining flights to be 15, 16, and 17. This decision was made in the context of the budget that the Nixon White House was willing to provide to NASA. So I'd say it's both NASA kind of nervous about another accident and Nixon that share the responsibility for the premature end to Apollo. And then Nixon himself got spooked by Apollo 13 in particular. In the end of 1969, the kind of iconic Earthrise picture was hanging in the Oval Office over Nixon's desk. You see it on the wall between Nixon and two of his advisors. By a year and a half to 2 years later, it was gone, replaced by a kind of generic landscape. Nixon didn't want to be reminded of the moon program. He tried to cancel not only the ones that NASA had agreed to cancel, but the last two, 16 and 17. His advisors basically talked him out of it. Nixon didn't always get what he wanted, especially when he was proposing things that didn't make a lot of sense. As Apollo 17 left the moon for the last time in December of '72, a long time ago, the White House issued a statement saying this is probably the last time in the 20th century we will have humans walking on the moon. And by his decisions, Nixon made that prophecy reality. So certainly he was no fan of the moon program. He did have a positive idea with a lasting positive impact, which was bringing international cooperation into the U.S. human spaceflight program. He was interested in flying astronauts from other countries on U.S. equipment. You see the quote in 1970, find a way of getting German, Japanese, British, and French astronauts to participate in our program. That interest led to Apollo-Soyuz with the Soviet Union and to Europe and Canada participating in the space shuttle, and really set the precedent for the International Space Station. So I think one of the lasting positive heritages of Richard Nixon is international engagement in the U.S. human spaceflight program. With the ending of Apollo, the decision to end the Apollo program, the question then was, all right, what next? As I've said earlier, the first NASA idea was to build a large space station. This is an artist's concept of that space station, and you see how big around it is, 33 feet across instead of 15 feet in today's. It was going to be launched by the Saturn V, and then you had this logistics vehicle bringing up, in this case, a capsule with crew in it, transferring the crew from the shuttle to the station. By the middle of 1970, it was clear that NASA was not going to get support for that or any other space station. NASA gave up in 1970 its plans for space station, and then all that was left was the space shuttle. And NASA had to develop a new rationale. And part of that rationale was stated very clearly in a letter that the acting administrator, George Lowe, wrote to the Budget Bureau, by now called the Office of Management and Budget. With the shuttle, the U.S. can have a continuing program of manned spaceflight without a commitment to a major new manned mission goal. Shuttle was building a capability without a clear purpose of what it was for. And that, I think, was the essential winning argument that led to the shuttle's approval, because it was clear that Nixon liked human spaceflight and was not going to be the president that ended astronauts flying in space. So the question became, all right, what kind of shuttle? And the idea that NASA was looking on was a fully reusable two-stage system, a large booster, somewhat about the size of a 747 on the bottom, and a smaller but still big orbiter on top. We're used to the orbiter. That's what eventually was built, with 3 engines in the rear. On the rear of this booster stage were 12 of the same engines. Truly an immense project. The performance characteristics were set out in a report that was jointly prepared by NASA and DoD, and NASA spent 2 years studying, how do we do this? How do we build this system? What were some of the requirements? The payload bay was 60 feet long, because our large photo intelligence spy satellite, the next generation at that point was called Hexagon, was 60 feet in length. So the length of the payload bay was driven by a national security requirement. The ability to go up and deploy a satellite in one orbit, or on a separate mission go up and rendezvous with a satellite in one orbit and then get back to the same launch site, meant that the shuttle had to be able to maneuver, the jargon word is cross range, because of the Earth's rotation. The runway would have moved 1,100 miles from where it was at the time of liftoff in one orbit, 190-minute orbit. That meant the shuttle had to have heavy thermal protection and delta-shaped wings, and that made it a heavier, more difficult vehicle to develop. The payload bay width of 15 feet, driven by some other national security, still classified requirements, and by the idea that shuttle would eventually be able to launch modules of a space station that would be 15 feet wide. And that's about the smallest that humans would be willing to live in for long duration. And the weightlifting capability, again, was driven by a variety of national security and space station performances to different orbits. So that was the vehicle, the so-called full capability shuttle. By mid-1971, NASA said, we can't do it. We're not going to get enough money. The White House had been clear on budget limits, and the technical challenges were too great. So NASA gave up in July of 1971 the thought of doing a two-stage, fully reusable shuttle, but wanted to get approval that same year. So in 6 months, the shuttle was totally redesigned, which is the engineers in this group, and there are a lot of you, say, redesigning a major piece of hardware in 6 months is at a minimum a challenge. NASA had a new leader. His name was James Fletcher. That's him being sworn in by President Nixon in April of 1971 in the White House. It was the Budget Bureau, George Shultz on the left, Nixon, a man named Don Rice, who was the associate director in charge of the space portfolio, and the deputy director, later Secretary of Defense, was Caspar Kapp Weinberger. Science advisor was a man named Ed David. The OMB and the science advisor were extremely skeptical of the value and wisdom of proceeding with the shuttle program. And so there was a very vigorous debate between July and December of 1971 on going forward with the shuttle. What NASA didn't know, and I don't think OMB knew either as this debate went on, was the decision that there would be a shuttle had already been made. The way Nixon made lots of decisions is he got memos, took them home at night, sat in the Lincoln bedroom or Lincoln study, read the memos, wrote comments on them, and then the next morning brought them back as decision papers. So here is a memo from Weinberger through George Shultz to the president, August of '71. You can read the text there. But basically it said, if we don't go forward with a human spaceflight program, it will send the wrong message that our best years are behind us, voluntarily giving up our superpower status. And it's Nixon's handwriting. I agree with Kapp. I would say this is basically the fundamental decision that there would be a space shuttle. And this was before this contentious debate. Here's Nixon talking about it. The first person you'll hear was Nixon's top policy assistant, a man named John Ehrlichman.
The Southern California people have mighty to press on for this space shuttle to be located in Southern California. And it's a highly visited kind of thing. Now, if we were to announce at the State of the Union sometime that you're going ahead with a space shuttle, that's a big statement. It's not very much outlay. It gets to be big. I wouldn't even make it isn't even a State of the Union thing. It's particularly interesting. I just put it out in California where you're going to put jobs, right, John? I don't think people get one down about a space shuttle. Well, they do in terms of jobs, and that's what I'm sure. So where the jobs are, it's California. Well, they're
Leadership. Here's the meeting, again, the formal budget meeting at which a decision that there would be a space shuttle was made, December the 3rd, 1971. There were two options, the NASA full-size shuttle and one much smaller, much more experimental, proposed by the Budget Office. Nixon chose the OMB version of the shuttle. And of course, NASA protested. And most of December of 1971 was spent in an increasingly nasty argument between the White House and NASA over which shuttle should be built. Finally, by the end of the month, NASA came in and said, we still think the big shuttle, full capability shuttle, is a best buy. And it seemed like the head of the Bureau, the OMB, the Budget Office, was agreeing. He said, come back over the weekends, New Year's weekend between 71 and 72, and I'll give you a final decision. The OMB head, Don Rice, and science advisor David strongly resisted this decision, saying it's really a bad quality national decision. They lost the argument. I think they were right, by the way. I don't think I say that later in this presentation. But on January the 3rd, Schultz met with NASA and much to NASA's surprise said, yeah, we're going to approve the full-size shuttle. There's no evidence I could find that Nixon was involved in that decision at all. I think it was made at a level below Nixon. And so Jim Fletcher and George Low were flown out to California, where Nixon was at the Western White House, and on January the 5th, 1972, met symbolically with Nixon so he could be seen approving the shuttle program. Shuttle had a name. There had been an interesting set of possibilities of naming the shuttle, and the one that was chosen is Space Clipper. Nixon didn't like it and said, no, let's just call it the shuttle. And shuttle it has remained. There's an interesting memoranda that George Low wrote of this meeting, quoting Nixon, saying, tell me it's not a $7 billion toy. And of course, the NASA leadership said, of course not. It's a really great thing. The statement after the meeting, Nixon never gave a space speech. His press office just issued statements. And this statement made promises for the shuttle, that it would revolutionize transportation into space by routinizing it, and it would take the astronomical cost out of astronautics. Shuttle was going to be routine and cheap. So, summarize for Nixon, 3 key decisions: to reduce the priority of space among the portfolio of government activities, to lower ambitions by not setting another challenging goal, but to continue human spaceflight, and to build the program around a vehicle, the space shuttle, without linking it to some broader concept, event, except kind of implicitly, eventually, a space station. And if you think about those decisions, they have defined the U.S. program of human spaceflight for the past 40 years. That's why I say Nixon is more influential than Kennedy. Were those good decisions? You can say, and the space community certainly says, Nixon made a major policy mistake by downgrading the priority of the space program. Advocates continue to argue for an increased space budget. It's also possible to conclude that Nixon made a good decision, at least in downgrading the priority of the program to match public preferences. His was not a leadership decision, it was a decision reflecting his reading of the political environment. There, as one of Nixon's young assistants said, no particular or compelling reason presented to the White House for pushing the space program. Why did he approve the shuttle? I think mainly I think it was jobs in key election states before the 1972 election campaign, but also the symbolic importance of a continuing program of human spaceflight as an element of U.S. leadership. And I did do an interview with his assistant, John Ehrlichman, who said that Nixon was intrigued by some of the military capabilities and uses of the shuttle. It's been over the years, particularly the Soviet Union said, well, the shuttle was really an anti-satellite system. I don't know how many of you from the community were here listening to Jeff Hoffman last week talk about the Hubble repair missions. But if the shuttle could rendezvous with Hubble, it could rendezvous with lots of other spacecraft. There was that capability. I don't think at Nixon's level, the idea of the shuttle being cheap and routine ever was very important, but that was the public perception of what the program was about. Implicit in the decision to go forward with the big shuttle was the fact that NASA would come back as soon as the shuttle started flying and say, now it's time to do the space station. And that's exactly what happened in the 1981 to 84 period. And it meant, once the space station program was started, that the shuttle had to continue to fly, because it was the only way to launch the space station. So those two programs combined something like $7 or $8 billion a year have been I call it a mortgage, a commitment on the NASA budget, which has been flat or declining, that made it really impossible to do any major new initiatives like returning to exploration. Shuttle's gone, but the station still costs $3 billion or more a year to operate. The mortgage continues to be paid. So, getting close to the end here. Two very different outcomes, two very different presidents. And I'm not going to read all of that, but Kennedy, I think, in making a decision to go to the moon, linked the politics of the moment, the competition with the Soviet Union, to a vision, to dreams of centuries. Nixon certainly did not do that. He linked the politics of the moment, the desire to reduce the federal budget, to reduce the deficit, to control the government spending, to a decision to limit U.S. ambitions in space. We in the space community have never really given up those ambitions, but they have been continually frustrated over the past 40 years. So here we are today with an image of what the space program should be about that is one of the residuals of John Kennedy, that it should be about setting a challenging goal, setting a deadline, setting a schedule, sending humans to travel to distant destinations. That's the mental image of what a successful space program would be like. But it's Nixon's decisions to limit ambitions, not set goals, stay near the Earth, that have kept us here for the past 45 years in near-Earth orbit. Now, Mr. Obama, on April the 15th, 2010, said, let's go to Mars in the 2030s. First to orbit and then to land somewhere in the 2030s. And NASA has implemented the president's mandate by what it calls the journey to Mars. But it's just starting. I mean, the NASA administrator, Charlie Bolden, is proud of saying that we're closer in the United States to putting boots on the surface of Mars than we ever have been. And that's true, but we're not very close. It will be up to the next president to see whether this journey continues, whether the moon is put back in as an interim destination on the way out to Mars or not. There are lots of decisions to be made to define the future of the U.S. human spaceflight program. And that's, I think, the major challenge facing the next president with respect to the space program. Will we ever have a Kennedy moment again? Will we ever hear a U.S. leader or another leader or the leaders of the world together say words like John Kennedy did in September of '62?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
We'll see. Thank you all. I believe there are microphones for the question, so why don't you both identify yourself and wait for the microphone.
Yeah, Ari Laor from the physics department here. What do you think are the prospects that China would be the new Russia?
Good question.
Encourage.
To which the short answer is they are not very high. China has made explicit what it intends to do with its human spaceflight program. And it has done exactly what it says it is going to do. So what China has said is a space station, a kind of medium-sized space station in the early 2020s, and then a period of utilization, and then perhaps human journeys to the moon in the 2030s. The US public seems not to care. There was the former administrator of NASA, Mike Griffin, during the Bush administration, tried to create the aura of a race with China back to the moon. And the political and public reaction was basically boredom, that it was not a potent enough reason to have a highly mobilized program. So I think, yes, eventually China, either by itself or with its allies, or hopefully with all of us, will go back to the moon. But it's not going to stimulate an Apollo-like reaction in the United States. There's some back up the aisle.
What about the private sector?
What about the private sector? As probably many of you know, the head of the space exploration technologies company, SpaceX, Mr. Elon Musk, has a plan for private journeys carrying humans, particularly him, to Mars, which he says he will unveil in detail at a big space meeting in September of this year. More power to him if he can actually do it. Musk is made lots of very dramatic pronouncements of what he's going to be able to do. And slowly he has accomplished some of them. So could he by himself finance the very high cost of human missions to Mars? I'm a skeptic, but I would like to be wrong. Because his timetable is about 10 years ahead of the US government's timetable. The problem is Elon is a visionary. He wants to get to Mars. I think he said he wants to die on Mars, so he's not ready to die yet, so he's not in a big hurry to get there. It seems to me the scale of resources required will inevitably necessitate government spending, maybe in a very productive partnership with the private sector, but there's no business case to go to Mars. There's not money to be made. There are, again, a whole set of arguments like species survival, human destiny, expanding experience for going to Mars, but for getting the private sector to invest in doing it, I think is unlikely, but I would, as I say, I would love to be wrong. There's Dr. Hoffman has a question down here. Okay, yeah.
You haven't mentioned Skylab. Was that more of a Nixon's thing or just NASA doing?
Haven't missed
Skylab. You haven't mentioned Skylab.
I'm still not hearing it. No.
Skylab.
Skylab.
Oh, Skylab. Skylab was leftover Apollo hardware that was never intended to have a long use or be resupplied. It wasn't designed to be resupplied. Get the mic back.
I was wondering about the decision making behind Skylab. Like, was that Nixon or was that just not?
Yes, it was NASA that what to do with Apollo hardware. that led to Skylab. And if you know that much, you know that there were two built. One that was launched in 1973, and one that's the most expensive museum exhibit in the world at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, is a flight model that was intended to be the second Skylab. For those of you that don't know what we're talking about, there was the conversion of the upper stage of the Saturn V rocket into a human habitation system that could support a 3-person crew. For the longest crew was 80-some days. There were 3 crews that went up in 73 and early 74, and that was called Skylab. It was a way to use leftover Apollo hardware, and it was explicitly an interim program to a real space station, one capable of resupply. So yes, the decision to launch the first one and not to launch the second one were Nixon decisions.
And that actually was my question, was about the decision not to launch the second Skylab, because had that Skylab been in orbit when the shuttle started flying, it might have changed the history of our space program. But I think you've answered that question. That I wondered whether that came from NASA or from the administration. You're saying it was the Nixon administration.
Well, and it was in the sense that NASA was focused on developing the shuttle, and the Nixon administration did not provide a budget even adequate to develop the shuttle, much less to sustain the operations of Skylab. And so it was never done. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned that in the early 60s, Russia was not in the race. So I was wondering if it ever was seriously in the race, and at what stage did they abandon the race to the moon?
Yeah, there's a straightforward answer to that. Russia began a lunar landing program in August of 1964. Between 1969 and 1973, made 4 attempts to launch the N-1 rocket. All were failures, while the U.S. had succeeded in getting to the moon. And so the Brezhnev administration canceled the program. Say again? Yeah, we're humans. Say, if you go to the Moscow, it was just in London, as a matter of fact, in the cosmonaut exhibit. The lunar lander was built. Alexei Leonov was trained to be the first Russian on the moon. But the Soviet leadership, seeing that the United States had clearly won the race, said, we quit. And they canceled the program and shifted to a focus on space stations in the 70s.
Hello, I come from China. I wonder, do you think there is some possibility China and the USA cooperation in some space program?
Good question. Possibility of U.S. and Chinese cooperation. As I said in the introduction, I'm currently doing the research for a book on President Ronald Reagan and the space program. And to my surprise, I discovered that there were very active plans in 1983, 84, and 85, so more than 30 years ago, for a Chinese scientist to fly on the shuttle. It's an interesting history question. You know, what if China had human participation in the U.S. human spaceflight program back in the 1980s? It didn't happen primarily, as far as I can tell, because of the Challenger shuttle accident, kind of canceled all of the innovative uses of the shuttle. So is it possible in the future for U.S. and China, as 2 of the 3 countries that have capabilities for human spaceflight, to work together? I hope so. But as you well know, the U.S. Congress has passed a law that prohibits NASA from cooperating with China. Hopefully, enlightened leadership in the future will convince Congress to change that law. But NASA is now forbidden to have bilateral interactions with their Chinese counterparts. And until that changes, the cooperation will not be possible. There are people in the current White House that would like to see cooperation, but they basically can't do it. So, yeah.
Hi. Do you think if the space program and NASA might be better off today if instead of having a sharp peak and fall in funding, that instead there was a gradual increase? Like, would it be better off with a gradual increase rather than a sharp?
It'd be better off with any increase. But certainly the kind of mobilization of effort that happened under Kennedy will not happen again. There's no national imperative, there's no political reason to devote that kind of money to the space program. Somebody before the talk tonight said, well, you know, the space station has been, combined with the shuttle, it's been $7 or $8 billion a year, and it's a 20-year program. So if you spent that much money on a Mars program or a Moon and Mars program on a steady basis and even increasing a bit with inflation, we could get to Mars. There's enough money. We, the United States, and better yet, the United States and its international partners can afford to go to Mars, can afford to go back to the Moon. We don't need a big peak in spending. We need political will to do it. And to date, that political will has not been strong enough. It's a political decision to just kind of go along without a long-term commitment. And as I said earlier, it's the next president that really will have the opportunity to say, yes, let's keep going, or once again, change direction. I hope the answer is let's keep going. Oh, okay, yes, sir.
In your presentation, NASA showed a suggestion to build a moon base by 1980s. Did they believe this to be an attainable goal? Do you?
Well, let's back up to say, in the same chart, it said we'd be ready to go to Mars by 1982. I mean, we had already landed on the moon, so we clearly demonstrated with the Apollo program the ability to transport humans and, by implication, cargo supplies to the lunar surface. So a continued program of utilization of the Apollo Saturn and maybe second generation hardware could have led to a lunar base in the 80s. I think that's much more plausible than the fact that we were ready to go to Mars by 1982. So my answer the short answer to your question is yes, I believe it could have been done, adequate resources, we had the equipment, but we didn't have the political will.
Hi, thanks again for a very enlightening presentation. I was just wondering, you mentioned that the suggestion of landing on the moon again was sort of received with boredom. I was wondering if your reading of that is simply the act of landing on the moon is what is leading to that boredom, or are we as a species, in some sense, generally bored with space exploration in this day and age?
Well, first what I said was the idea that we should race China to the moon received a kind of boring response. The idea of another space race. Is there public support for space exploration? There doesn't have to be. If it becomes a leadership issue, an elite issue, the public is relatively indifferent to how the money is spent. So the idea of a public demand for going back to the moon or space exploration, I think, is an illusion. It is a leadership decision that this is something that the world should do, that the United States should do. And so far, no national leader has both made that decision and provided the resources to carry it out. Hopefully the next ones will. I have no idea about timing, by the way. Somebody tell me when to quit.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting to have this discussion with you, but it's also quite bad to hear that there seems to be a great deadlock because there's no political will. Space agencies are underfunded. Collaboration seems difficult, and there's not a business case for going to Mars. So sounds the landscape looks a little bit dark, but I would like to know your personal prediction about how the next milestone in space exploration will happen, and that's going to Mars.
Yes. Maybe this should be the last question. Let me see if I can give you an optimistic answer. Because you correctly summarized some of the tone of what I've said. I don't think there needs to be the kind of political support that led to Apollo. A relatively steady commitment of resources without changing from Moon to Mars as the next government comes in, or having some stability in the program so that it can be planned on a long-range basis, I think it's necessary and possible. So, I mean, I stay in this business because I'm basically an optimist that eventually humans will want to travel beyond the immediate vicinity of this Earth. Whether it is going back to the Moon first or going directly to Mars is an open question. My own view is going back to the Moon on the way out to Mars is the right way to proceed, but that's a personal opinion. So I think that the dream stays alive, and that there are enough people that share that dream and link it to the position of global political leadership. Hopefully leadership in a coalition somewhat similar to the International Space Station. That can cause us step by step to have a long-range program of human exploration that someday, might not be the 2030s, it might be the 2040s, but you're the folks that are going to do this, not me. This is your generation that will do the management, do the engineering, and it's kids in elementary school who will get the ride. None of you, I predict, will be eligible to be on the first crew to Mars unless Elon is right. Yes?
Hi. Do you think it's achievable to build a space station for 200 people with artificial gravity? During the next 20 or 30 years with only private funding? Thank you.
Well, I'm waiting for the outcome of your assessment. So let's see what you say by the end of August. And again, for the local people, that's an inside joke. The students this summer have a variety of design projects, one of which is a 200-person privately funded station with artificial gravity. Good luck. I think maybe that's the time to quit. Thank you all.